We're on Facebook and Twitter with our post show continuing our discussion on the rise of violence against Asian Americans. Michelle Wu, I know you have a heart out, so let me ask you a question about what is the one or maybe two things that you think needs to be happening right now to not only keep this issue in the forefront, but also to advance some implementation of concrete things that could happen, policies that could make change?
Well, I think the community organizations and leadership, including folks on this in this conversation, have already been doing this, which is to create the spaces for organizing to happen, to connect this moment to the underlying issues and the context within our white supremacist system and all of our communities of color of how we must act in concert to end racism, right? To dismantle this structure overall. I think the concrete steps legislatively that could be extremely helpful to this are ones that the community's been pushing for a while: data equity and really understanding not just averaging all Asian American communities across the board, but sub-community by sub-community, what the uniquely what the impacts are and where the resources should go by various ways that our state and city government are collecting data. Language access is a huge piece of it. And just in general, creating the infrastructure for communities to have greater say over decision-making and policy.
And one more thing from you, personally, what has this been like these last few weeks since Atlanta? But of course, we know, as we've said, this has been going on for some time.
It's been incredibly difficult. I think it's resurfaced a lot of childhood memories in some ways of the first moments of realizing the need or the feeling of what it meant to leave the safety of home and be out in public and to potentially face strangers feeling like they needed to take action in some way to me and my family simply based on how we looked. But I think there's also a recognition now that this moment, it's time to stop the cycle, that it's a moment for people to speak up, to be heard, to truly connect with every other community as well. And so especially, as mentioned before, coming on the heels and intertwined with what we have seen over the last year and the disproportionate burden, how this pandemic has landed squarely on Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, how we have seen a reckoning on systemic racism over last summer, continuing to this day with the trial ongoing right now of Derek Chauvin. This should be a wake-up call in almost every way for our society to build the long-term stability and opportunity that we all need to thrive.
Okay. Carolyn Chiu, same question to you about what could we be doing right now? What's the one thing or maybe two things that you've already imagined a world where we're past a lot of this, but what practically can happen in this moment?
Yeah, well, one thing I want to lift up at the federal level is, deportation continues. The week of, even in the Biden administration, right? The week of the Atlanta shooting, 33 Vietnamese refugees were deported. And so, we need to end deportation, and that has to be, the crux of some of the work we're doing. At the state level, I think, as Michelle said, data equity and making sure we have real accurate and nuanced information about our community is a key step, as well as ethnic studies, which I think we've discussed here, language access, and then all the things about equitable recovery. But those are some, I think, are key parts of how we get at some of the roots.
And for you, what has this been like to experience these last few weeks of heightened attention and also heightened uptick in crimes against Asians?
Yeah, absolutely agree with Michelle. This at the intersection of race and gender is so core to what we know as Asian American women. And, my partner is actually from Atlanta. Her father's an Uber driver and her mother is a home health care worker in the Korean community in Atlanta. So for us, it hit particularly close to home that this is, it's about low wage workers. It's about immigrants. It's about the women who, are the backbones of our families. And so, yeah, we're holding a lot of grief, but also a lot of hope and possibility of how we can use this moment to transform the system.
Edward, what would you pinpoint right now that you think could be implemented that could make a difference concretely?
So I agree about the data equity. I mean, one example we talk about a lot here for our job training is that Asian Americans have the biggest wealth gap now, as shown by the Pew Institute research back in, I think, 2017, 2018. But in the same year, the FDIC did a study, and they excluded Asians because there wasn't enough data. So that sort of lack of data is not great for setting policy. And so we look at a lot of our grants and the policies that affect our workforce development programs. And a lot of times, Asians are not listed as a target group. And so right there, there's no resources that are shared for other groups. So that has to be evened out. The playing field has to be balanced out for the resources available.
And personally, these last few weeks, what's it been like?
It's definitely been horrific. I know a lot of our students here and a lot of our staff are concerned. We've had some of our staff just decide that they're not going to continue their visas. They're going to go back to where they originally immigrated from. On top of that, though, I will say, I grew up in the Deep South many, many decades ago. And, I was hit. I was called the different Asian slurs. I was even spit on. So to me, this has always been present. It's definitely heightened now, but it's always been there.
Mm-hmm. Bethany, policies, movements.
I would echo every single thing that everyone has said. I mean, from data equity to language access to ethnic studies to housing stability, everything that everyone said. I would almost like flip that question a little bit and ask what it is that we shouldn't be doing right now, because I think there's so much reaction to what we can do now and what would make sense now. And I would be cautious about policies that end up pitting communities of color against each other, that actually ultimately, disproportionately impact communities of color. And that, I think, involves some of the increase in law enforcement and policing that we are seeing as a response. I think we want to be careful about what those types of solutions might actually bring, because when we talk about safer communities, looking at increased law enforcement options does not necessarily make our communities safer. And so I would be very, very careful about those types of policies.
So not falling for the one slice of pie when there's a whole pie.
I think that's good. That's exactly the way to put it.
Okay. And then personally,
And,
I just wanted to get personally from you about, how you felt during this time.
Personally, I have not been surprised. I think that has actually, I would agree with Edward in that it's been horrifying, but I've also not been surprised. And so walking on the streets myself, I have in some ways thought a little bit more about what it means that at any moment we could be targets, right? And so that has been a little different, because despite knowing that harassment occurs, despite I think all of us can talk about situations in which, from young till now, slanty eyes and kind of ching chong things yelled at us. I'm not sure that I have fully felt physically unsafe. And so was just walking on the street. And so that has been different, even just thinking about what it means to take the subway and being by yourself, especially in less crowded streets, given the pandemic.
Someone wanted to speak. Was that you, Michelle? Did you want to add something?
Caroline,
or Carol?
it was me.
Okay, whoever. Okay,
yeah, sorry. Bethany and I spend a lot of time together. So it made me think of, I think also as Bethany's talking, right, it's both to not pit communities of color against each other, and because we know even within our communities, folks have do not have good experience of policing, right? Whether that's a domestic violence survivor who doesn't speak English and calls, but then gets arrested, right? Or, I'm really thinking about Christian Hall, the adoptee in Pennsylvania who was murdered by the police during a mental health incident, right? And so that is not to say that Black communities are not the most disproportionately impacted, but I think we have to, exactly as you said, Callie, like not just go for our slice of the pie and understand that we've invisibilized a lot of experiences in our own communities that are actually much more aligned with what we hear from other Black and Brown communities.
I just want to raise up something that each of you have mentioned in your own way, which is about bystander impact. And if you want to weigh in on that so people understand what that means. Michelle?
So, I mean, I'll create space. I know Bethany and Carolyn have both been part of sharing some resources. All I would say is that the immediate feeling of whether you're alone or whether you're in community can be switched just on a dime by the actions of just one person in that space, on that subway car, on that street. And so there's a lot that each one of us can do. And there are many resources to understand and get trained on that as well.
So, Carolyn, instead of the people in that building closing the door while witnessing this guy beat up on the elderly Asian woman on the street, you know, that's a perfect bystander, a potential bystander intervention, right?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I mean, we need folks to intervene and to de-escalate, right? Situations, whether they are obviously so horrific as that, or, you know, the smaller things, right, that we've all talked about and we've seen. So, you know, I think as we imagine community safety, it's also about all of us being in community in a different way and learning how to do that. So absolutely, we need folks trained up, but also just to use our own instincts to intervene in ways that de-escalate situations, that promote a sense of community and make sure, you know, we all feel safe in our city.
I think what's so horrifying about that lack of bystander intervention, Bethany, that particular one, was that as they were shutting the door, the guy has walked away and left the woman on the street, and there was no rushing to see what kind of condition is she in. There's no calling 911. There's nothing. I mean, that to me it just went right through you.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And you making sure that that's not what happens, right? I think doing the opposite of that is what makes for a safer neighborhood, especially when we're talking about people with a precarious immigration status or whatever, right? Because I think a lot of people don't feel comfortable calling 911. We actually have been fielding some calls recently through our legal intake line where we just heard from some people who said, you know, they did experience hate incident last year, but because of their immigration status didn't want to call 911. So what would it mean for someone in that setting to have helped to distract or, you know, called, you know, made some noise or something, right? I don't think it's necessarily calling the 911 ultimately that stops that immediate harassment, right? It's whoever's next to you on the street that could be helpful in some ways. And so there are trainings and there are resources for thinking about what it means to do that.
Edward, last word.
Sure. I think this is an artifact of a bigger issue because we talk about these horrific issues, but then what about the mild things which still can really impact someone's psyche? I mean, I've been in rooms where someone will say something very off color, and if no one speaks up, the person that's the target of that comment, they're just shut down at that point, and it's horrible. So while definitely someone should have reacted in that situation in the video, I think we can't just minimize it to these violent situations. It's got to be every time we see something anti-Asian, anti-ethnic, someone has to talk, someone has to take action.
The microaggressions, like where you from, Edward? That kind of
Exactly.
thing. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your insight, for your candor in this discussion. Thank you very, very much.